I can help you. And he had these wireless microphones he was making. He didn't invent them, but it was the first time they were being used in a television show. And he brought in the Aeroflex camera, which was a fraction of the size of the cameras that were being used on stage, on studios. And he brought in quartz light kits instead of these giant arc lights. And he built this thing called the Cinemobile, where he would load everything into this thing. And he even had a platform that could raise on the top of it. And they would put this thing inside a flying tiger and fly it to wherever they were going to be filming. And so that's how they were doing this show all around the world. Nobody thought it could be done. NBC didn't think it could be done. But the real innovation for that show, as you just mentioned, was the racial aspect. There had never been that type of casting before. There had been Amos and Andy, which most blacks hated, and I understand why. There had been Beulah, which was a sitcom about a black maid working for white people. And there was Rochester on the Jack Benny Show. And there had been a short-lived series called East Side, West Side, which had Cicely Tyson as George C. Scott's secretary.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a welfare worker in the slums of New York. So there wasn't great variety for black actors. And they brought Bill Cosby in to play an American spy traveling the world, carrying a gun, shooting at white spies, Russians, and things like that. And it never happened. And to show to tell your audience how new and pioneering this was, a headline that ran on the front page of Daily Variety the year before I Spy premiered, when the pilot had been made and the CBS and NBC had decided they were going to put it on the air, said NBC to start a Negro in a 60-minute drama. And in the copy, it said, and he's not going to have to sing or dance. And the subtitle was to see which way the winds are going to blow in Dixie, because they didn't know if the Southern affiliates would carry a show like this. So it was a very experimental show to see if it could get clearance on enough network affiliates to stay on the air. It did. It became a top 10 show, and that opened the doors for 1 year later for Star Trek to have an interracial crew, and for Greg Morris to be on Mission Impossible, and then you had Daktari came on, and then you had Ironside, and you start in Room 222, and you had all these shows where you were starting to get black actors in recurring roles that were not stereotypical roles. And then that opened the door a bit wider for shows like Chico and the Man and so forth. So so I Spy was the show that really kicked those doors open and stuck its neck out. And you're absolutely right about Robert Culp. Sheldon wanted Bill Cosby, and they went and made a test episode in Hong Kong. And he sent it back to NBC, and when they saw that they had put a black actor in there, they said, well, we don't know if we can go with this. And Sheldon and Bob Culp both united and said, if you're not going to let him go, we're not going to do it. And they very much wanted this show. Sheldon Leonard was one of the top producers in TV, doing the Andy Griffith Show, Dick Van Dyke Show, Danny Thomas Show. But he was tired of sitcoms. He wanted to do an hour-long drama. He wanted to travel. Bob Culp was one of the top stars on TV. He had a series called Trackdown, and he was a guest star on all these shows, and everybody wanted him for a series. But they didn't want Bill Cosby. But the minute that show got on the air, everybody wanted Bill Cosby.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, a lot of people don't know about Sheldon. He was a famous gangster in a lot of movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, great actor.
Yeah, he was an actor, and he played a gangster in movies and on radio. And Bob Culp always did a great impression of Sheldon Leonard, because they butted heads a lot on that show. Bob was wonderful. I did 7 interviews at his house with him for that book. And he was so open, and his ethics were just great. I mean, I would ask him a question, and he would look down at the floor for about 30 seconds, not with every question, but certain questions. And like, did you and Sheldon get along? And he would look down at the floor, and I'm thinking, oh, okay, better ask the next question. And he would look up, and he'd say, oh, what the hell, let's do it. And he would start to answer it, but he would think that carefully about it. Do I really want to say this? Do I really want to say something that it may be bad or be heard as bad about Sheldon and how we got along? And so I really respected him. And what a lot of people don't know is Robert Culp co-created that series.
Oh, he wrote a lot.
He wrote the first script called The Tiger, which was made during the first season, by the way. And he wrote it and brought it in where he was going to play an espionage agent who masquerades as an athlete and travels the world. And he brought it into Carl Reiner, and Reiner sent him down the hall to see Sheldon Leonard. And he told Sheldon his idea and gave him the script, and Sheldon read the script, and he comes back and he says, I like your idea, but I like mine better. And he says, 2 spies, 1 white, 1 black. The white guy's a tennis player, the black guy's his trainer, they travel the world. And Culp said, you're right, yours is better. Now, it was the same idea for a series, but adding this other character. And so you may notice, if anybody knows the show or likes the show or watches the show still, you may notice there's not a created by credit on I Spy. It just says Sheldon Leonard presents I Spy, because it was really a co-creation between him and Culp.
Oh, yeah.
And Culp owned a piece of the show and so forth. And Culp wrote a lot of the scripts, the formative scripts, and he was nominated for an Emmy for one of those scripts. He taught Bill Cosby to act. And he had a fun little signal with the director of photography. If they were doing lines and he could tell Bill was in trouble, he would give the signal to the director of photography, and the director of photography would yell, all right, cut, let's stop, I have to adjust the lights. 10 minutes. And so Bob would take Bill into out in the alley, wherever they were filming. I'd say into the dressing room, but they usually didn't have dressing rooms unless they were back at Desilu doing some interiors, but they were filming all around the world. He'd take him out in the alleyway, and he would work the scene out with Bill so they could come out and do it well. And this, and then every year the show was on, both of them were nominated and competing against each other for an Emmy as best lead in a dramatic hour-long series. And every year, Bill Cosby won. And I asked Bob how he felt about that, and he said, I felt vindicated because I knew we needed him, and I knew this was so important for television. And I figured I'll win Emmys down the road, but this has to go to Bill. This is important, and he was right.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, one of the texts he was telling me about, you know, he at one point was burned out, and he didn't know if they wanted to do another season. And, you know, and he was talking to Shelton and Bill Crosby, and maybe it was Bill Crosby who didn't want to do it. I can't remember now. But, you know, but then Bill Crosby said, well, to Robert, well, you know what? You know, if you want to do another season, let's do another season. But then all of a sudden they got the notice they were canceled, and they had high ratings. Now, do you know why they were canceled, out of curiosity?
Yeah. This is a really interesting story, Gary. This is one of those strange things. And it happened with the Star Trek books, and it happened with this book, where you're writing a book about these people, writing about the show, but I'm writing about everybody who made the show. It's a biography of a TV series. I turn into flesh and blood, because it is flesh and blood people coming together. And so I'm interviewing them, and I ended up bringing them information that they finally found out why the show got canceled. And the reason it didn't get canceled. Sheldon Leonard pulled the plug after 3 seasons. It was a top 10 show. Now, the third year, they moved it opposite Carol Burnett, and the ratings came down, but they were still good, very good, and the demographics were excellent. And so NBC wanted to pick it up for 2 more years, not just a single-year renewal like they usually do. We'll take a 4th season, and maybe later we'll say we want a 5th season. They wanted to renew it for 2 more years. And Sheldon was promised a 2nd hour on the network, and he came up with a show called My Friend Tony. And NBC, Mort Werner, did not like My Friend Tony. And so he called Sheldon, and he said, we don't have that 2nd hour for you. And so you're going to have to choose which show you want to do, assuming he's going to say I Spy because it's a hit. And Sheldon was very angry that NBC was pulling this on him because he was promised that 2nd hour. So he called Mort Werner back, and he said, okay, we're going to do My Friend Tony.
Oh, wow.
So NBC stuck it in a terrible time slot and canceled it after 13 weeks. I Spy went into syndication. Sheldon owned the show, so he had the power to do that. It was the first privately owned TV show. He financed it. He did it. He got to shoot it around the world. He didn't have to go to NBC asking for more money. He could spend whatever he wanted because he owned the show. They would license it for a certain amount of money, but he owned it, and he owned it for reruns. So Sheldon just decided he'd sunk a lot of money into the show. He didn't like what NBC was pulling. He and Bob Cope were locking horns over the scripts, and so he just said, I don't need the trouble anymore, and he pulled the plug on it. But he told Bob and Bill that the ratings had dropped, and they knew they'd come down because they'd gone up against Carol Burnett, and she was really hot that year, and they had been like winning their time slots. Suddenly they're not. But they didn't see the actual reports because they weren't shared with actors back then. Nielsen made them private. They said at the bottom, these cannot be photocopied. Return them to A.C. Nielsen. They were loaning them to the networks for a fee. And the reason they didn't share them with actors is because if you saw your show was a really big hit, you'd be asking for a raise. That's why actors now get paid $1 million an episode. Where back then you were making $5,000 an episode, which would be like $50,000 now. So it was keeping the ratings a secret. So Bill and Bob just believed Sheldon when he said the ratings had fallen. They had already written scripts for a fourth year. They had already gotten their shots. They were going to be going to Bangkok. And then after Bangkok, they were going to be going over to Sweden and then to England. And he was trying to set a deal where they could actually film in Russia behind the Iron Curtain. And Russia was interested in letting them come over there and do it, remarkably. And with all that planned for the fourth season, the plug is pulled. And so they just moved on. And when I brought this information to Bob Cope, he was stunned. And he said, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe Sheldon would not tell us the truth about that. And I said, Bob, here's the documents. And he got depressed. I talked to him a few days later, and he sounded really down. He didn't sound like Kelly Robinson at all, And he said, well, I've believed something for all these years, and I find out it wasn't true, and that I wasn't told the truth by a colleague, and it just really kind of knocked him down. And he said, I called Bill, and he believes it. He believes it because I read in the papers and all that. And then about a week later, I called him up because I had to schedule a couple more interviews, and I called him up, and he sounded like Kelly Robinson again. He sounded great. I said, you sound terrific. And he said, yeah, you know why? And I said, why? And he said, for the same reason I sounded lousy last week, because of what you told me. But the reason I sound good now is I realized we went out on top.
Oh, yeah. That show, Sheldon probably was the worst mistake he ever made. If the show went on to 5 seasons, when it goes into syndication, you make so much more money. This was I think a major mistake that Sheldon did.
Oh, it was. And he suffered. He was the top producer in television at that point. And after he pulled it away from NBC, you don't do that to a network. A network will get even. So the first thing they did is they took that My Friend Tony, stuck it in Sunday nights at 10 o'clock, I believe, and canceled it after 13 weeks, didn't promote it. Contractually, they had to put it on, but they can't guarantee a hit, but they can sure guarantee a failure.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what they did.
They buried the show.
And he went from being the top producer in television all the way down within a couple of years. Because Andy Griffith's show went off, because Andy Griffith said, I've done enough. We've been on for 8 years. Dick Van Dyke was tired. He wanted to stop. Danny Thomas was tired. He wanted to stop. And suddenly Sheldon doesn't have any shows on anymore. And everything he's trying to do, the networks aren't interested in. Well, because you cross a network and it's a small town. He pulled a hit show away from a top network. And suddenly he's not working, and you find out that you're not as powerful as you thought. So he suffered. And I Spy was number one in syndication for the first year it was off the network, but it only had about 84 episodes. So after a couple years of syndication, it kind of tapered off, and it's been out of sight for a long time, which is a shame because it's such a pioneering show, such an important show in the history of television, and it was a very good show.
Well,
and what a great title sequence it had. I love that title sequence. I think that and Hawaii Five-0 are probably the two best opening title sequences in the history of television.
Oh, yeah.
And just a fantastic show. I'll still watch it, but I don't know if a lot of other people do. But I've written a book so if anybody out there is interested in knowing how they did it, how they went around the world, how they got this mix of white and black on network TV and everything else, it's all in the book.
Well, the problem is, with Bill Crosby being in prison right now and all the, the
Yes.
flack he's under, nobody on the cable channels will carry I Spy.
Nope.
The only way I can
Or
get,
the Cosby Show.